Today, I'd like to talk about building a positive research culture. Now, most people will be able to recognize a negative research environment when they're in one. When it comes to a positive research environment, though, a lot depends on our expectations. So, when I'm talking about a positive research environment, what I'm specifically referring to is an environment where team members are empowered, recognized, have a clear career pathway, and can contribute to impactful and reproducible research. Now, first of all, why do I focus in this talk on positive research culture? Now, I think this question is quite obvious. Why would you become a leader if your aim is not to make lives better? And what is a better place to start with than the members of your own team? However, even if you are much more utilitarian about your work and your leadership, I think it is still really important to focus on a positive research culture. We know that the more positive the environment, the longer the staff will stay, and improved staff retention builds up the skill set of your laboratory. The free exchange of ideas that happens in a positive research environment will improve the creativity of your team. Happy teams are simply more productive, and managing a positive team in a positive environment is easier and more fun for you. So I think we need to make sure that we never fall for the false dichotomy of excellence or kindness. I would say that being kind and creating a positive research culture actually encourages and builds up the excellence in your team. So how do we foster a positive research culture? Well, in this talk, I'm going to go through a few tips, and then I'm going to go through a few limitations. Now, our first tip is to know your team and to celebrate your team. I think a classical mistake that people can make is to treat people as job descriptions. And people are never simply a job description. They are people first and foremost. Take the time to learn their story. Take the time to understand their motivation, what makes them tick, and celebrate that. Now, you don't have to go to the extreme of writing a book about everyone in your lab and all their different motivations and reasons for going into science and what they overcame. But the more you understand people as people, the better you're able to find a way to align their job to their motivation. And then they're really going to bring the most they can to the team. Now, just as you need to know your team, you also need to know yourself and communicate that. What makes you tick? How do you like to interact with people? If you know yourself, then communicate this knowledge to your team and potential recruits. When I'm recruiting someone to the lab, I tell them the type of manager I am, warts and all, the type of interactions I like to have. I don't want anyone to ever be coming to the lab under false pretenses. I want them to know the environment they're coming into. And when they join the lab, the start of our lab guide includes pages on how to manage me, the tips and tricks that other people will learn over time as to how to manage your boss. Why not just tell them up front how you like to be managed? I think it's also really important to hire to your strengths and weaknesses. I know that personally I'm very good at working with people that are underconfident and building them up, while I really struggle working with people who are overconfident and need to be brought down to reality a little bit more. It's just a matter of my personal skill set and my preference for managing, but it's something for me to keep in mind when I'm hiring staff. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I personally find the use of I language over you language to be a really useful approach to having meetings with your staff members. And if you want to follow up on that, I really recommend this book on relationships, but it's a scientific view of relationships by John Gottman. It's well worth a read, and it describes the I language over you language approach. Another tip that I would have for building a positive research culture is to build traditions inside your lab. Traditions are a way for you to signal your values, what's important to you, what you would like lab members to have important to them. It's also a way to signal that science makes progress through the cumulative impact of teams. You don't have to be solving a problem by yourself in a short amount of time. Instead, every step that we make as a team goes towards our greater mission. We have a number of different traditions in our lab. We use the graduation hat tradition that is very common in Germany. We also developed the golden pipette, which we give out every year for elegant experiments and contributions to teamwork. And you can see how they are signaling the values, and they're also signaling that we are all part of a team together and that the team is going to make a big impact over time. Now, the next tip is that words matter. And as scientists, I think we are often a little bit resilient to this. We are a little bit sloppy with our words because the concepts underlying the words are actually what matters. That's the data. But the words do matter when you're interacting with people. And it's important to always remember that to the people in your team, what you say has a greater impact than what you actually meant. Take something like just mentioning in lab meeting, I've got to repeat the experiment to boost that N and make the result significant. Now, of course, that's not what we mean. We mean we need to repeat the experiment to have a larger N with a greater power to see if the result is significant or not. But those types of words, make the result significant, will tell someone who's very junior that you want them to make the result significant. And that's a big problem. Or we need this result for the reviewers. No, we need to do the experiment and then we see what the result is. Or run this experiment so we can show the effect is cell intrinsic. What we should be saying is run the effect so that we can test to see whether the effect is cell intrinsic. Even something as harmless as great result. We should be saying great design, great use of controls, very clean data, and that result is very interesting. And these phrases, they do send a message to people, and especially when people are just forming their own views on how science works. In fact, this is where I want to move on to the warning signs, because some of the pathways by which people end up in a situation where they're committing fraud, these start with very innocent and very understandable issues. You can have someone who is just coming in with high expectations. And of course, people are coming in with high expectations. They're coming in to do science, to find something new, to change the world. And they will say things like, this experiment will prove my hypothesis, and they'll get excited about that. And that's good, unless the expectations are too high. Because at that point, you can also have a bit of unwillingness to admit setback. And suddenly you're thinking that other experiments are getting results. Why aren't my experiments working? The experiment has to work. And it's easy to take a step from there to imposing on yourself unrealistic deadlines. Maybe you've got a conference coming up and you'll just describe the data that doesn't exist yet in the abstract because you'll get the results before the conference comes up. And then you can add that to your talk or add that to your poster. You just put it in the abstract for now. The next stage can be bluffing. You thought you'd have the data and it didn't work, but you just tell the PI that the experiment worked and you'll show them next week because you don't have it on them or you haven't analyzed it yet. And then you're telling yourself that's okay because you'll come in on the weekend and repeat it. And it gets you in this situation where things start steaming out of control and you have insecurity to admit that you made a mistake. You can't tell them this or you're worried that you'll be kicked out. The whole edifice that you've built starts to become unraveled. And that's when the next logical step starts to be fraud. I want to know what the results should be. I'll just make up a data and then I'll do the experiments and I'll put in the real data at the end. And this is the pathway which you can see can start out so innocently, and it can just by these small little steps end up in really a major problem. So we have to understand that the risk mitigation can start with things as simple as the use of the language of testing. We're not trying to prove the hypothesis, we're trying to test it. We have to share our expectations and make them reasonable expectations. Dial back that high enthusiasm that can lead to these dashed hopes, and just let people know it's okay to have a slow start. That's normal in science. It's okay to have failures. That's normal in science. Science is about failure upon failure upon failure before you take that little step forward and then start failing again. We need to share those failures. We need to celebrate effort over outcome. That was a great experiment that you designed. I saw that you worked really hard on that. You've really got great controls in there. We need to fix this problem, but we've already gone a long way, and the next step will help us get there closer. And then try to reduce the pressure and uncouple results from reward. If someone's ready to go to a conference, they're ready to go to a conference. You shouldn't be saying you can go to the conference if you get that result, because that's creating this type of perverse incentive to go down a pathway you really don't want your team members to go down. The same as bluffing. This can only happen if you haven't set up your systems for transparency. If data is freely available within your lab, if it's clearly transparent when experiments were done, people won't be tempted into a bluff they can't get away with. In order to stop people from being insecure about making errors, you have to build trust. You have to affirm the value of your team. You have to let them know that what you care about is integrity and honesty, and that you understand failure as part of the process, so that everyone feels comfortable in admitting when they have a failure. And then finally, the whole way through, you have to emphasize integrity. As a scientist, what we want is to find truth. We want to get closer to truth. That is the most important thing. And our legacy is about getting a little bit closer to truth, and not about the papers and the grants and so forth. Now, before I finish up, I want to just talk about some of the common impediments for action. I think everyone listening to this video would be very much in favor of a positive research culture. And yet many of us are not doing as much as we could in order to create that positive research culture. And I see some common impediments that are stopping people from taking action. Now, one of the most common is a feeling of powerlessness. It's especially common in technicians and students and postdocs, people working in a lab where they're not in charge. And if the environment's not a positive environment, they might feel like they just can't change that. And I think it's really important for people to remember that the influence that you have over other people in your team, it's partly about authority, but it's also a lot about the time you spend with them and the trust that you've built up together. So you can actually have much more influence over the rest of the team than a PI who has more authority, but might spend a lot less time with those team members and has built up a lot less trust. So let's consider like a typical scenario. There's a toxic PI who has set multiple early career researchers to compete on the same project. And you can say this is a toxic environment, and it is, and it's a toxic PI. But there are ways that you can counter that. I was in a laboratory where multiple early career researchers were set on the same project. But in that environment, the students and the postdocs and the technicians were all friends, and they would all talk to each other and go away after a meeting with the PI, trade notes, and then just work out between themselves who was going to work on what and to support each other. And just to let things take their track and tell the PI what the PI wanted to hear about that there was progress on the meeting, on the project. And in that way, even though the management at the top level was toxic, the actual environment in the lab when the PI was not there was actually quite positive. We'll take a second scenario. It's not uncommon, a lab member being shot down for negative data or shot down for poor data at a lab meeting. It happens a lot. We are very critical as scientists, and sometimes we forget to consider what we say through the perspective of what the other person is going to feel. And if this happens in front of you and you're not the PI, you might feel very uncomfortable about challenging that. But you don't have to challenge it in order to make a difference. You can go up to that lab member afterwards and say, oh, I know you got told off, or you got your PI was disappointed because the data was negative, but that was really clean data. You had all the right controls in there. Variation is low. Yes, it's negative, and some people really struggle having their ideas shot down. But the point is, you got to the right answer, and that is a really nice experiment that you did. And I just wanted to say I appreciate that. Or maybe the data is kind of poor. Maybe there wasn't the right controls in there. In that case, you can still go up and say, look, I know it's really tough being shot down in these lab meetings, especially when the PI shoots us down for not having skills that they haven't taught us. And, I went through this myself and it was rough. Do you want to sit down a little bit and go through your next experiments so I can give you that feedback? And if you're in an environment where the people around are supporting each other, even those sort of toxic top-down effects can be overcome by the positiveness of people inside their team. Now, the second common impediment is a lack of proportionality. And this is one that I see especially frequently in new investigators. And the lack of proportionality can go in both directions. One common pitfall is the tiger parent. This PI wants to see every lab member reach their potential, which is great. But it implicitly places their own priorities upon the lab member. It can smother that team member with care, and it can distract them from other important duties and even make them neglect other team members. And here I would say, remember that it's your job to provide opportunities to your team members, but it is their choice as to whether or not they pursue them. People have different priorities. For some people, a career in science is their most important priority. Other people are happy to have a 9-to-5 job and to see where it goes, and they might be pursuing their key happiness through other endeavors, and that's absolutely fine. That's their choice. Now, the pitfall can also go in the other direction, and this is the direction of unrealistic expectations. And so here sometimes you'll see a PI who assumes that every PhD student is born with the skills that they remember having at the end of their PhD, and they're just constantly disappointed and putting on more pressure. And it's even more unfortunate because they're usually misremembering their skills. Here, I think it's really important for these PIs to remember that pressure doesn't create excellence. They're probably misremembering. It's very easy to forget how huge the strides are that you make between the start of your PhD and the end of your PhD. And our progress is never linear. And honestly, the average student is average. And you have to accept that. You can't just squeeze pressure on them until you make them into the person that you want them to be. That's not your role in the lab. Now, the third common impediment for action is what I'll call poor perspective. And this one I think is especially common in senior investigators. You might see the unsympathetic senior investigator. In my day, we had to walk 10 miles through the snow, and kids these days expect it all. Now, here the problem is that, no, they didn't. And new investigators don't expect it all. There really is genuinely a different reality to what the reality was for senior investigators in their day. The support mechanisms might be higher now than they were back in the day, but also the expectations are higher. What you need to discover to make an impact in the field is higher. The job security in academia is lower. It's harder to get academic jobs. We can't just pretend that these anxieties aren't real. They are real. Sometimes they're misplaced, but then we have to inform. We don't just ignore. Now, the other way this poor perspective can play out is, again, in the opposite direction. You do have senior investigators who really have built an entire career on their team, focusing on their team, helping their team, and have really built up a lot of credit and their team's trust. Now, of course, no matter how much you're focused on your team, we all have bad days. We have days where we don't get a grant. We have committee meetings that go awfully. And then we come back in the lab, we see another paper rejection, and then we get asked a question that we've answered 3 times already. And, you can get a bit frustrated. You can get a bit snappy. It happens. And, I always say you have to forgive other people and you have to forgive yourself. But you do need to recognize that even if you have spent a decade having your team's back and building up trust, your team aren't mind readers. They don't know what you're thinking. And if you regret something, unless you say that, they're not going to know that. Plus, many of your team members are new. We, as PIs, can look back over 10 years and 15 years, 20 years, and months and even years can be a flash in the pan. But if you've got team members who only joined a month ago, you haven't built up trust with them. And you can't fall back and rely on that. You have to build up that trust with each generation of people and earn it over and over again as a PI. At the moment, I've been really busy for the last couple of weeks. I've had a couple of talks to prepare and a couple of grants to write and a lot of teaching duties. And for the first time in 10 years, I've just sent out an email to the lab saying I've got to cancel all meetings with people in the lab for the next 2 weeks. I'm just not going to be available. And for the people that have been in the lab for a long time, they all know this is not normal for me. And they know that I'll come back and I'll be there for them. But I've also got some new master students. They don't understand what the lab's normally like, and understand that when I get back from this and I get that last grant submitted, I have to come in and make it up to them and build up from scratch, something that they don't automatically have because they don't read my mind. Now, finally, the last issue is problematic policy. And this is especially true in leadership. Sometimes you'll see someone in a leadership position who is clear and articulate with their values, but their policies send the opposite message. Perhaps it's someone who is campaigning on equality for women in science, who somehow only manages to hire men, or someone who is a keen supporter of DORA and looking at the science and not the publications, but they link all the promotions to publications. These are the types of places where you're sending 2 messages, one in your words and one in your actions. And it's the actions that people listen to. If your actions don't match your words have no meaning. And if you're in a leadership position, you can change policies, and you should change policies so that they match your values and they match your words. With that, I want to finish up. I've had the pleasure of working with just some absolutely amazing people over the last decades, over at the VIB and KU Leuven in Belgium and Babraham and University of Cambridge in the UK. If you're interested in my current team, I wrote this book about their backstories. They're fascinating people with great stories to tell. And if you're interested in more career advice like today's talk, then I recommend you go to our lab website, and we've got a career advice resource now, where we have links to multiple different papers that we have written on career advice at different stages, everything from finding a PhD position to running your own team. Thank you very much.